One of the difficulties of studying the Bible for the novice and the expert alike is keeping all of the different persons, events, and dates straight that are indicated in the Bible or that the Bible refers to. Oftentimes, the different events and persons are written in biblical books that are written long after those different persons lived or those events happened. In this video, we're going to present a very flyover approach, the important persons, events, dates, and time periods of biblical history. This is in order to expose you in a different kind of way to these persons, events, and timelines. And the more often that you are exposed to them, and the more often you practice recalling and retrieving the order of these different events, and the order of the different time periods, and the order in which different persons show up in the biblical text, the more likely you are to be able to sort of situate them with respect to one another. So the purpose of the video is not necessarily to get you to memorize every single date that is named in this video, but it is to get you a little bit more familiar with the different persons, dates, events, and time frames that make up biblical history. So let's go ahead and move on over to our timeline of biblical history. What I'm going to do is put different events up onto this timeline. We're going to look at them a little bit more close up, and then we'll zoom back out to give some different names to the different time periods that are represented on this timeline. The caveat here is, of course, that not every biblical event is depicted on this timeline, and maybe not even every really important event. There are some things left out from this timeline that are important, but the purpose of this timeline is to give us the general overview of what happens in and around the Bible. So, if we think about the very beginning of the story in the Bible, it is when creation happens. And here we have Michelangelo's The Creation of Adam. We do not have any firm dates. The Bible does not indicate the time or the day on which creation happened. But the implied timeline from Genesis and from the Old Testament is that creation happened around 4000 BCE. Of course, modern science says that creation happened long before this, and the biblical text does not purport itself to be a sort of scientific or historical representation of exactly when creation happened. But if we're trying to get our bearings about us for our years, if we're to sort of look at the different generations that are indicated in the biblical text and calculate those up, what might be implied is that creation happens around the year 4000 BCE. And the reason this is important, it helps us to sort of think about the amount of time the Bible implies takes place between different key events and persons. So our next key person in the Old Testament is going to be Noah, depicted here by Russell Crowe from the poster for the film Noah that came out around 2014. And the implied date for Noah and the great flood that destroyed all of the humans that had sort of proliferated from the time of creation until Noah, the implied date for that is at about 2400 BCE. Our next event is going to be, or next figure is going to be Abraham and his offspring, and the offspring immediately after him in the form of Isaac. Our artistic depiction here is Audie Ness, who is a modern Israeli photographer who does staged photography. And so in this one, this is Abraham and Isaac, Audie Ness's depiction of the famous account of Abraham's potential sacrifice of his son in Genesis chapter 22. And the implied date for Abraham is there's sort of a range here around 2100 BCE to 1800 BCE. And in the case of all of these persons, and in this sort of entire time frame, and all the persons that are not mentioned in this timeline but also show up in the Old Testament, for all of these, we do not have sort of firm extra biblical evidence to when these events took place. That is to say, writings from other nations or from other groups don't mention things like Adam, persons like Adam and Eve, or Noah, or Abraham. So we aren't able to sort of look at other sources and determine when these figures might have existed historically on the basis of those other accounts. All we have is the Bible for sort of reconstructing the timeline for what is called the early history of Israel. we start to get on a little bit firmer ground when it comes to Moses and the Exodus. That is to say, more firmer ground as to sources outside the Bible that seem to imply something about the existence of figures like Moses and an event like the Exodus. This is Charlton Heston here as Moses in the famous film The Ten Commandments. And Moses in the Exodus. So we have Abraham and his offspring, or the offspring of Abraham, multiplying many generations later, ending up by some unfortunate circumstances in Egypt and being enslaved in Egypt. Moses is the figure that leads the Israelites out of Egyptian slavery in the event that is celebrated still both in Christianity and in Judaism, known as the Exodus and the Passover. So the date here is typically pinned in scholarship to around 1445 BCE to 1250 BCE. And as I said, we're starting to get on a little bit more firm ground with respect to extra biblical evidence as to when these events might have happened from sources that do not come from the Bible itself. And we get to on even further ground when we start to get to the kings of Israel. The most famous of these kings is King David, though he is not the first nor the last king of Israel, but is a good representative figure of the kings of Israel, here depicted in Marc Chagall's King David. And the Israelite monarchies last from 1025 BCE to 586 BCE. So we start to get Israelite kingship or an Israelite monarchy in 1025 with the first king of Israel, Saul. And initially we have 12 different sort of tribes of Israel. So in the period between Moses and the kingship, once the Israelites go into the land that they will occupy right here, what is now the Holy Land of Israel and Palestine, initially they are 12 sort of loosely confederated groups or tribes of people, and each tribe has its own sort of leader figures. Eventually, these tribes sort of coalesced into one nation that gets a king in the United Kingdom of Israel. So we see here the 12 different tribes. These are named in the biblical text itself: Simeon, Judah, Reuben, Gad, Benjamin, Ephraim, Dan, Manasseh, Issachar, Zebulun, Asher, Naphtali, and Manasseh. So these 12 tribes sort of eventually band together to form one kingdom of Israel, what is called the United Kingdom or the United Monarchy, first under Saul, King Saul, the first king of Israel, and then next under David, the most famous king of Israel. And so here we have a purported depiction of sort of the extent of David's kingdom at the time of his death. So you can see how it sort of spans a fairly distant or a very large geographical range. This is sort of the heyday of the kingdom of Israel, and really the heyday sort of Israel as a whole. But we have under David, and then under Solomon in particular, David's son, the first temple is built. So previously the worship of the Israelite God, Yahweh, happened sort of in not a permanent place. And from the period of 960 to 922 BCE, the first temple is built and maybe looked something like this in modern reconstruction. And during the same period in which the temple was being built, the monarchy divides. So rather than having one kingdom, we have two different kingdoms: a northern kingdom known as Israel and a southern kingdom known as Judah. And so this is where we are going to get our terms Israelite and Judean or Jew. And eventually Israel is going to go away altogether, which is why now Jews refer to themselves as Jews, though the idea of sort of an Israelite history and the modern state of Israel, which is not the same as the ancient kingdom of Israel, still exists in our language and terminology. So, as it goes, empires rise and fall. We saw that the united monarchy of Israel had a sort of large imperial footprint, existed on a large scale, had a lot of influence. And this was true until the division of the monarchy, when these two different kingdoms exerted influence in different kinds of ways, but then began to encounter different, more powerful empires in different kinds of ways. And we're going to depict the next few empires in villainous form in order to sort of make them perhaps a little bit more memorable. So our first visual depictions of the Assyrians, who have their sort of interaction with Israel between the period of 722 and 612 BCE. So this is not the entire period that the Assyrian Empire existed, but this is the period in which Israel and Assyria are corresponding in particular ways. And Assyria gets depicted in this villainous way because what happens is they spread throughout a large portion of the ancient world. And if the Israelites are sort of our protagonists in the story, the Assyrians and their takeover of Israel are going to function as the antagonists in our story. So in 722 BCE, Assyria takes over the northern kingdom of Israel. The northern kingdom of Israel falls to the Assyrian Empire and no longer exists after this point. The Assyrian Empire does not, however, take over the southern kingdom of Judah. The southern kingdom of Judah still exists, which is where the important capital city of Jerusalem was and where that first temple was built. So the Assyrians do not take over the capital city of Jerusalem. They do not take over the center of worship for Judah and for Israelites, namely the temple in Jerusalem. And you can see here, this is sort of the extent, this green here, this green right here is where, how far down the Assyrian Empire sort of spreads. And the Assyrians did, in fact, try to take over Jerusalem. They sort of came into Judah, sieged it, and sieged Jerusalem itself, but were never actually able to capture Jerusalem and the territory of Judah. So the extent of the Assyrian Empire with respect to Judah comes right up to their important capital, but Assyria is never actually able to take it over. And so what happens is we still have a king in Judah during the Assyrian period, and the temple still actually stands during the Israelite encounter with Assyria. So as the trope goes, empires rise and fall. The same is true of the Assyrian Empire. It would not last forever. It fell to an empire that sort of usurped it, and it's going to also be depicted here, in villainous form as Kylo Ren's mask. So continuing with our Star Wars theme, and the interaction between Israel and the Babylonian Empire is going to be from 612 BCE to 539 BCE. So you can see how the end of our date of the Assyrian Empire butts up with our beginning of the date for the Babylonian Empire. And I put in parentheses the very important date of 586. You'll also see it sometimes as 587. There's a little bit of debate which year was it, 587 or 586. It's an important event took place. We'll talk about what that event is here in just a moment. So the Babylonians come along and they do what the Assyrians could not do. That is to say, they take over Judah. So the Babylonians, in their takeover of Assyria, take over what was formerly the Israelite kingdom, the northern kingdom of Israel, but they press even further south into Judah. And it takes them a little bit of time to be able to take the capital city of Jerusalem. So you see two different dates here. 598 is when they really start to sort of siege the city of Jerusalem and start to attempt to take over the capital city and the temple, but they're not able to actually accomplish that until 586 here. So in 586, the Babylonians are successful in their takeover of Jerusalem. They come into the city, destroy it, destroy the temple, and send people who are living in Jerusalem into exile. So this is going to be a formative event and a formative memory in Judaism, even until today. And sort of Judaism changes from this point forward, so that persons who are living in Judah and Jerusalem are taken to live in the city of Babylon. So we follow our line here, the exilic line from Jerusalem to Babylon. And so the result here is that under the Babylonians, and particularly after 586 BCE, there is no longer a king in Judah. The kingship is sort of snuffed out altogether, and the temple is absolutely and utterly destroyed. It no longer exists. But as the trope goes, empires don't last forever. They rise and fall. So we have another villain that comes along in the form of Mr. Rogers. And we have this villain represented as Mr. Rogers here, this empire represented as Mr. Rogers here, because the Persians took a very different tact from the Assyrians and the Babylonians. They were still very much an empire. They were still very much concerned with spreading their influence and taking over peoples, but their takeover of peoples was not to sort of squash them out altogether and make them conform to a new way of living or a new identity. Rather, it was to sort of incorporate them into the empire while allowing them to maintain their own identities. So what the Persians do is they allow those exiled Judeans to go back to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. So what happens is there's still no king in Judah. And we have here a depiction of the sort of expansion of the Persian Empire. So our area of interest is right here in Jerusalem. We can follow this line here. You see it says the return of Judean exiles under Ezra's leadership. So Ezra and Nehemiah are going to be two important figures related to the return from exile. So the Babylonian period is characterized by exile, while the Persian period is what is called post-exilic. The people return from exile, and you can see this line here, whereas formerly our line went from Jerusalem to Babylon. Now it goes from Babylon, people, the Judeans, returning to Jerusalem in order to rebuild the temple and reestablish the city. And so this happens. The foundations for the new temple, or what is called the Second Temple, begin in 520, and then construction of the temple takes some years, somewhere around maybe 5 years or so, is probably rebuilt around 515 BCE. So the temple stands once again, but it is a new rebuilt second temple. Some time goes on, and once again, empires fall, this time the Persians falling to the Greeks. And the Greeks, in some ways, especially the Greek Ptolemies, are going to take somewhat of a similar tact to the Persians. They're not going to allow for a king, but the Judeans still are able to live in Judah. They're still able to have their temple and worship their God, and sort of live into their identities. And so we see here Alexander the Great is sort of the key figure for the spread of the Greek Empire. He is the one that's depicted on that picture right over here. This is a beautiful ancient mosaic of Alexander the Great. And you can see just how far the Greek Empire spreads throughout the world at that time, all the way down into Egypt and over to the east. Whereas formerly we saw with Babylon and the Persians and the Assyrians that our area is really sort of just right here. The Greeks are sort of starting to spread out even further. And so what happens is that Alexander the Great, after spreading this empire so wide and far, dies at a relatively young age in 323 BCE, and does not leave an heir to sort of be a king of a Greek empire, as it were. And so Alexander's empire, the Greek Empire, or what is often called the Hellenistic Empire, gets divided into two, essentially, between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, or at least it gets divided into as to what is relevant for our purpose. We also have the Antigonid Empire over here, but they are far from our area of interest in Judah and Jerusalem. And you can see that the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire, which are sort of subgroups of the Greeks, they're going to butt up right near Jerusalem and Judah. And so when you have two different groups exerting power at one particular place, this is where you start to sort of have a rub, or you start to have trouble on that place where things meet up. So Jerusalem and Judah find itself sort of at the center point of conflict between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, and there sort of goes back and forth of who is ruling Jerusalem at different times. Early on, it's mostly the Ptolemies, and then later on, it's mostly the Seleucids. As we said, the Greek Ptolemies really sort of take a similar tact to the Persians. They allow the Jews to sort of worship in their temple. They allow them to maintain their unique identity. But that changes a little bit when it comes to the Seleucids in the period of around 200 to 164 BCE. And that 164 BCE is going to be a very key date. Well, the Seleucids take a different tact, and particularly Antiochus IV Epiphanes takes a different tact and really tries to suppress Jewish identity. He goes into the temple, the Jewish temple, and sort of profanes it, changes it to a temple to the Greek god Zeus Olympus, and sort of he does what is called forcing Hellenization or Greekification onto Jews. Those things that sort of particularly identified Jews as Jews, he told them they could not do those things anymore. So he gets depicted here, or the Seleucids, in particular Antiochus IV Epiphanes, gets depicted as the evil wizard Voldemort, who is interested in sort of snuffing out all identities of, in the case of Harry Potter, human culture. In the case of the ancient world, the Seleucid ruler Antiochus wanting to snuff out Jewish identity and make them take on Greek identity. This does not go over well, and particularly the profaning of the temple does not go over well, and leads to armed rebellion against the Greek leader Antiochus Epiphanes IV, and the armed rebellion on the part of Jews, and particularly a group called the Hasmoneans, who are in fact successful in taking Jerusalem and the temple back over and establishing a kingship for Judah once again from the period of 163 BCE to 63 BCE. And sort of the reestablishment of the temple and the reestablishment of the kingship is celebrated in the festival of Hanukkah today. And our last empire that's going to be of relevance for this class and for the Bible is the Romans, beginning in 63 BCE, or their relevance to Jerusalem in particular begins in 63 BCE with Pompey the Great. And so under the Romans, the Jews kind of sort of have king figures. The Romans are very much interested in having local leaders in place from those particular groups, but they want those local leaders, they want them to have the identity of the group, but they also very much want them to be in the pocket of the Romans. They want them to sort of be, in a way, puppet leaders, so that they have the face or they have the identity of being a Jew, but the Romans also know that they are going to cooperate and do exactly what the higher ups tell them to do. So this is why we have depicted here sort of a king, also sort of not a king in Jerusalem under the Romans. And you can see here, once again, the extent of the empire, just as the extent of the Greek Empire expanded upon what the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Persians were able to conquer, so also with the Romans. So we get all the way out here to the west and still over in the east. And this is in the period of the New Testament, towards the period of the New Testament now. So you can see AD 117. Most of our New Testament texts are probably already written by this point, most written between about 50 CE and 100 CE. During the period of the Roman Empire, you can see this sort of extent of its influence here. And so then to move to the New Testament itself, and to get some figures out there, we have Jesus living at the from the period of about 0, which is we get that number purportedly by the birth of Jesus. And here Jesus depicted in one of my favorite Jesus portraits by Edoardo Palazzi, Jesus Color by Numbers, a pop art artist in the 1970s. And then we get the figure of Paul and the first writing of a New Testament document around 50 CE. So even though we often think of Jesus as before Paul, the writings in the New Testament, the first writings in the New Testament, come from Paul and are not the Gospels themselves. So the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are actually going to all be written after most of the letters of Paul. So Paul writes First Thessalonians, probably the first letter or the first writing of the New Testament, somewhere around 50 CE. And this is Lovis Corinth's Der Apostel Paulus, one of my favorite depictions of the Apostle Paul in art. In 70 CE, just as the Babylonians long before had destroyed the first temple, a sort of uprising or a rebellion in Jerusalem caused the Romans to sort of react, squelch that rebellion, and destroy the temple in 70 CE, which would never be rebuilt again. So if you go to Israel today, you can see sort of some of the remains of this second temple, but the temple no longer exists as it did before 70 CE. So 70 CE is going to be a very key date, both in New Testament and in Jewish history, because the temple was destroyed by the Romans at this point in time. Excuse me. Perhaps some 30 to 55 years later, depending on whom you ask, the latest or the last New Testament letter was written, either probably between the period of 90 CE and 125 CE. It's easy. It might be easier for you to think of it as a nice round number at 100 CE, thinking of the New Testament documents written from 50 CE to 100 CE. And so here we have, this is P45. This is a papyrus manuscript of Hebrews, which is probably the last New Testament text to have been written. Though, of course, there is some debate about which of the New Testament texts was the last one to be written. So to zoom out on our timeline, we have all of our different empires, our different persons, events, writings depicted here. And I want to throw out some different terms that are relevant to these different persons, events, and periods. So when we're thinking about the from creation to Moses and the Exodus, really this sort of, in some ways, sketchy historical period, that is to say, we don't have a lot of external historical references to this period outside of the Bible itself. This often gets called the early history of Israel. Another term is going to be the pre-exilic period, and this is going to go all the way from the early history up to the time of the exile. So anything that happens before the exile, which was under the Babylonians, is going to be called the pre-exilic period. And sort of within the pre-exilic period and in the time frame of these kingships, we have the monarchical period. This means the sort of kingly or kingship period. That is to say, when Israel had kings. So that's going to go all the way up until we get the no king icon here. And the Assyrian period is going to be the period in which Israel is engaging with the Assyrians. The exilic period is going to be a relatively short period, though not unimportant. So small in time, large in importance, and it's going to be during the Babylonian period. So the exilic period corresponds to the time of exile in Babylon for those 50 years or so. The post-exilic period is going to refer to the time in which the Jews came back to Jerusalem and is going to continue on to the end of our timeline here. The Persian period is going to refer to the time in which the Persians and the Israelites or the Judeans were interacting. Our Hellenistic period, or you can think of it as Greek period. Hellenistic is another synonym for Greek, is going to be from the time of Alexander the Great up to the time of the Hasmoneans, when they sort of take Jerusalem back over. And the Roman period is going to extend from 63 BCE to the end of our timeline. Another very important term that you will often see is the Second Temple period, and this refers to the time in which the Second Temple stood. So from about 515 BCE until it was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. And so our last two things to note here: most Old Testament texts are going to be written in this period here. This was a particularly productive literary period in ancient Israel and ancient Judah from the time of the exile. So there's writings happening during the exile through the Persian period and into the early Hellenistic period. So while many Old Testament texts actually write up these things back here, or they tell us about the events that happened in the early history, they are actually written not during the period of the early history, but are written during the exilic and post-exilic period. So it's important for us to recognize that while the events depicted in many of these texts that we will be reading and engaging in this class are the things that are depicted happen in the early history, they're actually written up much, much later on. So it's sort of looking back onto the ancient past, as it were. It'd be sort of like us today writing up the history of the founding fathers of America, but in reality, actually, it would be even much further back for these folks, insofar as we're looking back thousands of years rather than hundreds of years, which would be our case. And then lastly, all the New Testament texts, and excuse me for covering this up here, all the New Testament texts are going to be written in this period here, starting with Paul and the first letter he wrote, probably First Thessalonians, in about 50 CE to about 100 CE, with the writing of the last New Testament text, probably the New Testament book called Hebrews. So there you have it, an overview of biblical history, a timeline of some of the most important persons, events, and time periods in the history of the Bible.